ніж з того боку.
It's November 15. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheprenko, and within the framework of the main discussion platform of Ukraine Brain Camp, we will talk about bringing Russian propagandists to liability. We will understand that propaganda is a part of the military strategy of Russian Federation, and distortion of reality, planting of their narratives is a state program of the enemy of the Russian Federation. Now, the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security presents their research called Genocide Rhetoric of the Russian Regime. So let's talk about this study and the main topic, how we can use the results of this study to make sure that all the propagandists are brought to liability. Let me introduce our speakers. It's Igor Solvey, head of the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security, Sergei Zhukov, Volodymyr Zelenchuk, lawyer of the center, and Taras Senkev, the deputy of the Department of the War Crimes of the Office of Prosecutor General of Ukraine. So, Mr. Igor, before we proceed to the study, why did you decide to study the genocide rhetorics within such an important topic as bringing the propagandists to liability? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to see all of you here in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. I appreciate that you found time to visit this important event. My name is Igor Solvey. I'm the head of the Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security, and I'm about to present you the results of our half years of work dedicated to the study of genocide rhetorics in Russian propaganda. Let me start. Before we started our study, we were basing it on the fact that there are no mass media in Russian Federation in the classic understanding of its word, in understanding vested in it by the global communities. The Russian regime cemented their power long ago, and the first ones to be repressed were media, which became known specifically after the 24th of February. They've all become a part of the war machine of Russian Federation. In parallel with that, the regime has become very rigid, which persecuted alternative opinion that was different from the opinion of Kremlin. The people who did not consent with the position of the authorities, they were either put to prison or they were squeezed out of the country, or otherwise they were put a label of a foreign agents, which complicated their work. And the media were shut down, and the most vivid examples are a package of the biggest editorials, Дождь, Новая Газета, and others, and Echo Moskvy. And another argument was so-called Roskomnadzor, the supervisory body that commits, so to say, atrocities in Russia, shutting down the media resources that are opposing to the government. So the people who don't consent with the official rhetorics are being repressed in Russia. They are being penalized or sentenced to prison, and are given quite a serious sentences. So there is no freedom of speech in Russia. Everybody who tries to broadcast any opinion of some events unfolding in Russia, specifically the war, they are all part of this war information machine. They are the warriors of information front, and therefore they are subject to the same type of liability as those soldiers running around Ukraine with the arms in their hands, driving tanks or other armored vehicles and occupying the territories of Ukraine. Based on that, the main task of ours was to vindicate the criminal intention of the propagandists, because propaganda is a part of war aggression. This is why when we were starting this study, we focused mostly on the official part of it. What I mean by that is that when, well, there are two parts. There is a visual part, something that we see on the TV, something that we may read on the media, the calls to destruction of Ukraine. But there is yet another part of this problem, when all those public Solovyovsky, Skabeyevas and others, so what do they base their calls upon? Is it their initiative or is it a coordinated government policy? So by this study we want to demonstrate that all those statements are not initiative of those specific persons, but it's a coordinated policy of the Russian government. This is why we were focusing on the analysis of the state documents, the laws, school textbooks, official publications of the official persons, for example, the statements of president in the website kremlin.ru, which is the official position of the state. So we've studied quite a thick layer of information materials that resulted in this study. Mr. Sergei Zhukov, my colleague who works with me in our center, who worked on this study, may tell you in better detail about this study. Mr. Sergei, can you please tell us about what is genocide rhetorics, what this notion means and includes, and what are the main methods of spreading this genocide rhetorics? Good morning, dear colleagues. I want to thank everybody who joins us during this event and expresses interest to this study that we present. We even have a presentation ready based on this study. Here is the remote controller, so we can proceed straightforward to the methodological part of our study. Technically saying, something that we were relying upon trying to identify what genocide rhetorics is. We have two key international documents. First is the Convention of the United Nations for Prevention of Crimes of Genocide, the definition of the crime. You can see it on the screen right now, and the components are murderings of people, mass murders of people, relocation of children from one group to another. So basically those components of crimes that are already investigated by our law enforcement agencies, that we gather evidences for, and so we understand the genocide rhetorics as public calls to all those types of actions, to committing of these crimes. And another important document is that conviction of Felician Kabuga, the infamous founder and director of the Radio of 1,000 Hills, that was actively calling to mass murders, to genocide, to ethnic cleansing in Rwanda. And what's interesting about this conviction is that it's the precedent of bringing to criminal liability on an international level of a person accused of using genocide rhetoric as co-organizer and associate of the crime of genocide. And in this sense, the genocide rhetorics are the public calls to murders of some group of people, in our case Ukrainians, use of different euphemisms and other instruments for dehumanization of the group, to make sure that those who commit the crimes directly, they take things that they do easier, and the audience that observes it all could perceive it as normal or even positive, because it's like they're not killing people, but they're killing Nazis or cockroaches, pigs. Well, we may find different examples of genocide rhetorics, and it's obviously normalization of explanation of necessity of this genocide, those acts of crime, those criminal activities which make up the genocide. Also, it's about the speculation on the religious feelings, so it's the whole list of criminal things listed in that conviction that we base our study upon. As Igor has already mentioned, we were studying not the broadcasting of Russian TV channels, because different guests are coming there and allow themselves of different statements and different calls that can be considered genocide rhetoric. So our task was not to demonstrate that Russian media space is filled with that rhetorics, and there's a lot of people we understand that they are propagandists affiliated with Crimea, but their connections are supposed to be corroborated, even if they are Duma deputies, that they make those statements as deputies, not just as the regular people who are outspoken on TV. So our task was to focus on those three or four elements: the legislation, the laws and regulations issued by the state of Russian Federation and implemented by the state bodies. Then the school textbooks, first of all history textbooks, because they are printed upon the request of the government. They are being approved by their Ministry of Education, I mean the government authorities. The statements of publicly exposed persons, first of all Putin. Well, if you listen to the Russians, Putin is perceived as the main source of power in the state, is the main authority, the main newsmaker, the main political actor. So a person which expresses the government ideology that is being broadcasted on lower levels of the government by all of its representatives. And fourth is the publications in the media, publications in official editorials, official media of Russian Federation, like the editorials of State Duma and so on and so forth. So all of those are official government sources, and we also paid a lot of attention to those publications that were made by the employees of those state media. And it's also necessary to highlight that in Russia, the media which are financed by the government, they are not just financed by the government, they are in different kind of relations with the government, because if we check out the articles of association of VKTRK, for example, it says forth very clearly who approves their articles of association, who appoints the directors of those companies. And just to remind you briefly that the director of VKTRK is appointed by the President of Russian Federation, so those ties between the authors of this content and the government, they can be very clearly tracked here. So different remarks that those may be private thoughts or just private statements are a very weak proof. So what we identified during our study, during our analysis of all those 4 types of sources that we studied within this research, within our work. So first of all, the legislation of Russian Federation did not contain any genocide rhetorics. However, Russian Federation is degrading, and probably soon they will set forth some provisions in their legislation that describe Ukrainians as cockroaches or pigs that can be clearly construed as genocide rhetorics. However, what's interesting, what we've identified in Russian legislation was number of discriminatory standards against Ukrainians, both Ukrainians in occupied territories that Russia considers their territories, and the citizens of Russia of Ukrainian origin. For example, in Russian Federation is prohibited to be a member of a civil organization related to Ukrainian diaspora, for example, abroad. They have lists of those organizations, such as Global Congress of Ukrainians, and all the organizations, or like cooperation with this organization, is undesirable. They try to coordinate all Ukrainian diasporas all around the world, and thus being a Ukrainian in Russia is something undesirable as well, or even dangerous. However, we know that Ukrainian national minority is quite large in Russia. And back in their day, in the 90s, even in the beginning of the years 2000s, they were quite active, but then a number of court indictments shut down all those organizations, and the heads of those and members of those organizations were facing intimidation and physical violence that can also be considered as a coordinated policy of Russian Federation. Secondly, Russian Federation in occupied territories is performing a linguicide, which means they restrict the use and circulation of our state language, and even regardless of the fact that according to the Russian Constitution they have one federation subject, Autonomous Republic of Crimea, where the use of the Ukrainian language is official. All the government procedures are exercised in Russian language, which means that the citizens of Russia of Ukrainian origin, they cannot exercise their rights of recognition with their roots, of their cultural rights. And also Russian Federation is establishing a database of actions taken against Ukrainians which are parts of genocide, relocation of Ukrainian children from one national group to another, forced deportation, well, facilitated adoptions of children, facilitated passportization, deportation based on a humanitarian premises from the area of battle operations or area where the martial law was announced in the depth, relocation of them in the depth of Russia. So all those acts were approved by the government of Russian Federation. They were amending the existing legislation on martial law. They were adopting new laws to facilitate all those processes. And another interesting thing that we've seen, that the regulation on annexation of Crimea and other occupied territories, they demonstrate non-existence of such ethnic group as Ukrainians. They juxtapose it with such things as the people of Donetsk Republic, people of Crimea, people of Zaporizhia region, people of Kherson region, Mykolaiv region, and so on and so forth. That's the demonstrative misrecognition of existence of Ukrainian people and attempt to deny the existence of Ukrainian people in all regulatory acts issued by the president or the State Duma of Russian Federation. So this is something that we can see in the legislation. Clearly discriminative standards, then legalization of those things that are components of crime of genocide, and discrimination and failure to recognize the existence of the Ukrainian people. Their rhetorics of the authorities, first of all, we talk about Putin, maybe even more vivid is the rhetoric of Medvedev, because he allows himself of even more vivid rhetorics that even sometimes is difficult to discern from the rhetorics of the Radio of Thousand Hills, but we can segregate the key narratives. First, they are being stated by Putin, and then they are developed in either more soft or harsher forms by other representatives of propaganda. We have to say that Putin and other representatives of Russian authorities don't recognize the existence of Ukrainians. They live in a paradigm of the trinity of nations, like the nations which the single nation made of three peoples, like Russians, Malo-Russians, basically Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So some of them still think that Ukrainians are just a made-up people, and based on that, Ukrainian language cannot exist, it's artificial, Ukrainian identity is artificial, and respectively, it results in circumstances when on a state level the first person and the top-level government officials, they state that the Ukrainians never existed, which means they should not exist now or in future. So it's a very clear component of genocide rhetorics that was described above. So talking about the state media, they continued developing and pushing the same narratives, and in the pages of state media such as RIA Novosti, that is a part of the holding Russia Today, TASS, VGTRK, and others, they publish the texts that not only deny the right of Ukrainians to exist, let alone their identity or their state. They clearly contain genocide rhetorics that describe Ukrainians as sick people that are supposed to be cured from the disease of their Ukrainity. And those articles are made by the employees of RIA Novosti on the website of RIA Novosti, which is a part of Russia Today. So such publications were emerging almost every day in the end of February and the whole of March of years 2022. Back then, in the beginning of year 2022, RIA Novosti issued the program text of Timofey Sergeyev, a spin doctor, which described the scenario which contained concentration camps, re-education, quote-unquote, forced re-education of people who consider themselves Ukrainians, physical eradication, ethnic cleaning, eradication of active nationalists, and so on and so forth. And in the state media and in the rhetorics of the government officials, we see negative euphemisms aimed at dehumanization of Ukrainians. The most widespread euphemism is Nazis, and we have to sadly state that it works not only for Russian audience, but this rhetoric has not emerged in year 2022, and even sometimes the representatives of foreign or rather Western journalism crowds or Western politicians, they start thinking maybe there are really Nazis in Ukraine. But in year 22 the situation has radically changed, because if previously, starting from year 2014 or even year 2004, the Nazis in Ukraine were some specific people who captured the power in year 2004 and they oppressed the rest of Ukrainians, and the rest of Ukrainians suffer from that. So in year 2022 all of the Ukrainians have become Nazis in the rhetorics of Russian state media. So they started talking not about some specific group that adheres to some specific political opinions, but basically about all of our citizens, all of the Ukrainians, all the representatives of Ukrainian nation. So thus the state media work very actively on dehumanization of Ukrainians, and using all those tricks and tools that you can see on our slide as to the rhetorics of the state media. And talking about the textbooks, that's my favorite topic, so to say, because I'm back in my day I liked to read what the Russians write about Ukrainians even before the year 2014, but in the year 2014 the situation started becoming different, and there was very, I would say, big lack of impartial approach to Ukrainians in Russian textbooks. Then Putin set a task to create the new history textbook to make sure everything is standard there, the standard set of events, the standard assessment of those events. So the Russian Historic Society also joined this process. Well, Russian Historic Society, headed by Mr. Naryshkin, who is infamous for other areas of his work. So it took them some time, and in the years 2016-17 they've implemented a number of those textbooks edited by Medinsky, and another edited by the Dean of MGIMO and co-student of Kovrov, and they've issued the new option of, well, the new version of the history book that was presented pompously and implemented starting from the 1st of September 2023, not in all of the Russian schools, as one textbook for Russian school children. So if we analyze those textbooks that were issued from years 2014 to that one that was issued recently and that was used in the high school of Russian Federation, there is a lot of similar things there, but also there are some differences, and the differences are that the textbook didn't describe Ukrainians in a very complimentary manner. They were describing Ukrainians as ethnic group that always was under an external influence, and that external influence was considered as standard if it's a Russian influence. In case it's some Western influence, say Austrian or Czech or Polish, that was considered to be a deviation. So all those narratives about Ukrainian Nazism were promoted there, but again, some specific groups of people were described as Nazis there. And also, what should create the negative sentiment against Ukrainians was, for example, that Ukrainians are inclined to treason, because their hetmans were all treachers, including Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who did not only enter into Peryaslav agreements, but was trying to look for other political unions after being accepted by the Moscow Tsar. So other hetmans were even worse, because they were looking for some foreign masters elsewhere. So it all falls within the standard of negative attitude to Ukrainians. So in this last textbook, we have a clear statements about Ukrainian Nazism, Ukraine as an ultra-nationalistic state, Ukrainian description of Ukrainian government as junta, so all of the Ukrainians are described as Nazis. They are represented as the enemy who should be fought, and Russia has all the rights to destroy that enemy with all means possible. So it's a propaganda that moved from statements of Putin to the pages of Russian school textbooks, and this is how Russian generations of youth are educated. So what are the conclusions? Is that the Russian regime on a systemic basis, on a state level, discriminates Ukrainians and commits such actions that are components of crime of genocide, and they have created legal base for that. The Russian regime works on dehumanization of Ukrainians using such euphemisms as Ukrainian Nazism, nationalism, so negative terms, and some specific representatives of Russian regime allow themselves calling Ukrainians not only Nazis, which is an absolute evil in Russian political culture. So the image of the enemy should be an image of a Nazi, but he allows himself of calling us pigs or cockroaches, fully reciting the rhetorics of the Radio of Thousand Hills. And again, they describe Ukrainians as non-people, but rather as Nazis, and Nazis should be treated as our grandfathers treated them back in 1945. So those are the key things that I was going to say today. Thank you for your attention. Let me add some organizational things. So we've started this study based on all sources, and we've ended, as of probably 1 month ago, the documents that were emerging like about 1 to 2 months ago. And so we continue tracking any new documents that may emerge and that may fall within the framework of our monitoring. Also, we hope, well, we don't hope, it's a fact, this study will be translated into English language shortly, and we are about to promote it for our foreign partners so that they see the criminal activities of Russian regime. And another thing I want to emphasize is that we hope that after we study this work, Upon the request of our colleagues from law enforcement agencies, we hope that this study will be of practical use for the investigation. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation of this study. So, Mr. Taras, it's clear that the propagandists of Russian Federation are the criminals. What is the liability they should be brought to, both on international level and on the level of Ukrainian legislation? Good afternoon. It's obviously so. Everybody who commits crimes are subject to liability. Those who commit international crimes, first of all, the Convention of the United Nations on Prevention of Genocide that was mentioned today contemplates such liability for calls to actions that such as genocide, and both Ukraine and Russia are the signatories of this convention, but it's clear that in Russian Federation for the time being there is no mood for investigation of any of such facts. However, I've never heard about any such investigations. I don't know about any such facts, let alone bringing the perpetrators to liability. This is why all this work should be done by us, because such facts shouldn't be let beyond our attention. What I can say is that the security service of Ukraine performs the pre-court investigation, and the court, the office of the prosecutor general investigates the public calls to genocide of Ukrainians. This investigation is performed in parallel lanes. I'm not going to take a lot of time describing the way it's being performed, but it's clear that we see sometimes some calls, but we don't research the system. Who performs those calls, who makes the statements? But those are the facts that should be investigated and analyzed, because in their preparation to the full-scale invasion, it's obvious the aggressor was preparing not only the tanks which entered our territory, but also they were preparing the places of detention for Ukrainians. They prepared special certificates for the people who counter the special military operation, trying to re-educate them, and one of the parts of all that process was the genocide rhetorics, because without such support in Russian society, a number of activities could not be justified. This is why Russian propaganda uses all means possible, starting with the political government of Russian Federation and ending with individuals who have certain influence in religious communities, trying to plant some parallel reality in the heads of Russian citizens, and we should be talking about it not only inside Ukraine but also abroad. And I'm happy that this study and the other studies of this type will be translated into English language, because I'm sure they don't have time to analyze all those things. They may think it's a rhetoric of some private individual who decides to express their thoughts, but it's clear that in the Russian mass media there is no free thought anymore for a long time. Everything is directed stories that are broadcasted to us. And I would like to thank my colleagues for preparation of this analytic document. We will use it in our investigations for sure. We will use all those accents that are being mentioned by our colleagues. All those conclusions will be laid as fundamentals for investigations in tests, and something that we will use for conviction of Russians in courts and the head of Russian Federation, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they have certain diplomatic immunity. We cannot bring them to liability here in Ukraine. This is why we hope that the Tribunal for Crimes of Aggression will be created, and we rely upon the awards of the International Criminal Court. We've seen already such indictments related to the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children, and we on our end have to continue this systemic work, to use those systemic studies to make sure that none of the propagandists who currently works against our state and commits international crimes and war crimes, that they are known to the society and are brought to liability. Maybe there is already a list of suspects who are currently being investigated. I mean, the propagandists, and probably you may call some names. Well, obviously there are channels where those statements are made and broadcasted. There are heads of those channels, there are directors, there are main propagandists. We know how the textbooks are being disseminated for that propaganda, but I don't want to disclose this information so far. I think it will become aware to the society after finalization. Mr. Metro, there are certain ties between the people who launch those narratives and those who initiate them, those who make statements, and it demonstrates those ties, that it's no accident, that it's a part of the government policy. So how does it help the lawyers, other representatives of government agencies, in collecting the evidences and bringing them to court as ready-made cases? Well, first of all, I would like to thank my colleagues for this work. It's very important in the following context. First of all, we have available practice of international courts, tribunals, in terms of bringing the propagandists to liability, the workers or the employees of that same radio of Thousand Hills, and analysis of such practice corroborates the fact that the court doesn't only take into account the individual liability and specific calls spread by the propagandists, but also the context in which those crimes were committed. So they create foundation for those calls, which are in fact made by Russian Federation, which are part of their policy, that they result in the cases when the propagandists, they express direct calls to representatives of Russian Federation to commit crime of genocide against Ukrainians. And what's also important is to have our law enforcement agencies to prove that those patterns that were already mentioned by our colleagues, such as euphemisms, creation of discriminatory policy against Ukrainians, and other such patterns that can be seen not only in the case of Felician Kapuga, but also in an infamous case of media on bringing through representatives of the radio of Thousand Hills to liability for genocide rhetorics. So international courts define those patterns as such that help identify the intention for genocide or specific acts of genocide. And in this context, it's important for us to document all those facts, because they, in case of investigation by the International Criminal Court, they will be laid as fundamental for public investigation. They will reinforce it and help disclose the whole context in which the crime was committed, and the practice says that this context is taken into account, and it corroborates the fact of the public calls or the definitions as they are described in Rome Statute, the inciting of crime of genocide. And what's also important is to mention that the inciting to genocide, calls to genocide, become even more important in this context, and it's important to identify who of those propagandists was spreading those calls in which media. So our institution, the Institute of Mass Information, is documenting those narratives. We hand them over to the law enforcement agencies on a periodic basis. We publish the research in regard of specific propagandists, and we hope that no matter which mechanism is used, whether national or international, they will all be brought to liability. Thank you. Mr. Igor, Mr. Serhiy, you've mentioned that genocide rhetorics did not emerge on the 24th of February 2022 and not even in the year 2014, but even earlier. Well, based on your observations, when did this machine speed up? When did it become more straightforward? And what were the things that Russian Federation was, or some things that Russian Federation was trying to veil previously, became unveiled? Well, the propaganda was changing during the course of battle operations in the battlefield. For example, before the 24th of February, before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the propaganda was aimed at intimidation. Well, you remember, they were spreading footage on moving of material across the borders, military trainings, military exercises. They aimed at demonstration of power of Russian Federation army, and they were aiming at creation the feeling in Ukrainians that resistance is futile. And then there were calls by Putin to the officers when Putin was stating that it will be easier for us to agree everything with you. They were aimed at fragmentation of the society and thus decreasing the ability to resist. That was one stage. Another stage was after the Russian troops captured the south but were not able to capture Kiev, and that Operation Kiev in 3 days, it failed, and propaganda started justifying that failure. And starting from that stage, we find certain disorientation among the propagandists who were not understanding quite well how to continue this line, because the first plan was aimed at blitzkrieg, and when it failed they had to change on the go. Then there was a number of other stages, but I don't want to repeat myself. They were all directly related to the battle operations, such as Kharkiv operation or liberation of Kherson and so on. Propaganda, we have to understand that it's mostly aimed at creation of alternative picture, which does not always, well, frequently does not correspond with the real picture, but sometimes that picture failed, just like we've seen it during the Kharkiv operation, when a prompt operation by the Ukrainian armed forces made the official propaganda end up in torpor, and thus the military, so-called military correspondents started taking the first places, who started communicating the situation from the battlefield, and they got formalized as a specific category. Well, something like that. Thank you very much. Dear journalists, please join our conversations and ask your questions. Victoria Shevchenko, Ukraine Forum. My question is, what should Ukraine focus on to counter Russian propaganda both in Ukraine and on a global level? Maybe we underperform somewhere and we should focus our attention on those areas. Well, whom would you like to respond? Well, let me start. That's a question for yet another press conference. So just in a couple of words, let me try it. First, we didn't lose the information war. We're winning. It's not my subjective opinion. It's based upon a number of specific things. All of the aims set by Russian propaganda, they are unfulfilled. So first, they wanted to suppress our resistance. Well, they failed here. Ukrainians are fighting courageously for the second year, and no one is going to change anything. Second, Russians were going to undermine our international support. It failed too. The support is still there. There is international coalition to support Ukraine. We continue getting financial, military, political support from our partners. Does it mean that it's a fact? No, the situation is dynamic, it's changing. This is why we need to keep working on that. What can be done? We in our center, if we approach it from a scientific point of view, we see three main ways of countering propaganda. First, banning of enemy channels of communication, of information. So we've done it in 2014, starting with ban of Russian social media such as Odnoklassniki and VKontakte, which positioned themselves as platforms for communication. In fact, were the platforms for information operation, for psyops, for collection of personal details, and other Russian products such as antivirus software, accounting. They were also used for collection of personal data, for attacks on critical infrastructure. Then Russian media, which worked in every single house, the cable networks, they were broadcasting Russian channels, First Channel, NTV, Russia 1, and so on and so forth. After they were all banned, the information space of Ukraine has become way cleaner, and the final court was when back in the year 2020 we've banned pro-Russian or Russian channels that were mimicking Ukrainian channels. A known pool of Medvedchuk channels. Why am I saying they're Russian? Because they were funded by Russian Federation. Now it's already proved by the law enforcement that this state assets of Russian Federation, of Rosneft, were handed over to a private individual, Viktor Medvedchuk, in payment for his propaganda. Well, I don't know why they afforded it, but it's their own business. Well, so first is the ban of Russian channels. Second area is creation of our own content. We've seen that the banned Russian content was changed with our entertainment, musical content, political content. And third main way is the media literacy. It's very well developed in Ukraine, unlike in other countries of the West. It aims at making sure that the citizens can identify the propaganda influence, so that influence that is screened by first and second stages. So we think that Ukraine is not only one country that is currently under attack of Russian information troops and Russian information influence. is the whole civilized world. And this is why since Russians are waging information war with not only Ukraine but everybody, we have to all join our forces, the European Union's United States, to counter the information influence of Russia. Without consolidation in the information front, we cannot win, in fact, in the battlefield. Thank you, Mr. Taras. I just wanted to add a couple of words. I agree with my colleague. I just want to mention that propaganda is usually based on clear lies or manipulations or distortions of facts, and our task very frequently is to debunk some fakes and to make people aware that that information is not true. And after a number of such debunkments, I think that the people reading these or those editorials will think whether a story, this or that story, is true. For example, there was a story about the shelling of the camp of our prisoners of war in Olenivka, where right upon the explosion, the representatives of special forces of Russian Federation were invited, who brought parts of HIMARS missiles that were collected in the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk region to represent the strike as a HIMARS strike. And after a number of debunkings, including the ones made by the United Nations, the society got convinced that it was not true. Another question will be in English language, so please take the equipment in case you need it.
Slava Ukraina.
Героям слава.
I bring you greetings from Avdiivka. So it's quite hard down there for the guys and girls who are working there, as you know. We speak of propaganda, and we speak about propagandists, and we speak about what punishments they should have. In the past, we had operations. We had operations to eliminate these propagandists, like Graham Phillips, Patrick Lancaster, Alexander Khodorkovsky, Putin, Medvedev when he was in Crimea and the occupied territories. But the government vetoed all these operations not to eliminate these guys, and we could have. And what we need to understand is that these propagandists, after we win this war, will stay in Russia. It'll be very hard to get them when we had opportunities to get them. So how will the government move forward to try and bring these guys to war crimes in The Hague, for example? One of the members of my team who spoke to RADA, Dr. Glenn Kolomwitz, a war crimes prosecutor, I brought him from Australia to talk to RADA about this. And we were told that the Ukrainian government can only prosecute if they can somehow bring these people from Russia to a war crimes trial. So how can we do that?
Можу до вас питання.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not authorized to comment some specific military operations. I think that there is a reasoning why these or those operations were or were not fulfilled. But talking about the liability for the people who are currently outside Ukraine, well, it's a complicated way, but the history knows a number of cases when people were brought to liability who were seemed to be impossible to be brought to liability. We know the stories when the representatives of Nazi regime were brought to liability after decades after they committed specific crimes, when they become available for the justice and they were brought to court to be brought to liability. So I'm convinced that in this case there will be justice in their regard. Talking about the measures that we may take, first of all, It's the in absentia bringing to liability in Ukraine with restriction of their ability to live abroad, with the arrest of their assets, informing all of the society that those people are criminals, and they're rendering them unable to communicate with the global society. But I'm sure they will not evade liability. Just to add a couple of words, it's not a topic of today's presentation, basically, but we really cannot comment any operations of the special services who deal with such matters, but I can only relate to the open source information in Russian Federation itself, when the most odious propagandists usually state about the threat to their lives, and they report on the threat to their families. Well, probably there is a reason for that, but we understand that sooner or later the punishment will be for each and every of them. Do we have any more questions? Well, thank you. I'm having not more of a question, but rather a comment. I'm Maxim Mayorov. I represent the Center of Strategic Communication. And to add to what Mr. Ihor said, do the propagandists feel fear for what they do? Yes, they do. And there is a number of statements they were making, starting with Margarita Simonyan's statement. Then she said that if we lose, we all end up in The Hague. Even the janitors, well, the janitors may relax, they are exempt. But I would like to quote the deputy of the permanent representative of Russian Federation in United Nations, Dmitro Polansky. He stated that we never were threatening Ukrainians as a people, Ukraine as a state. That was a propaganda invention of the West, that if Ukraine stops to fight, they will stop exist. I don't know where they got it. So after everything that was said, there is a cynical statement behind which there is understanding that criminalization of this propaganda is underway, and soon the liability will be for all of them. Well, thank you very much for joining our conversation, and I would like to remind you that within the main Ukrainian discussion platform Brain Hub, we were discussing the Russian propaganda and how to bring the propagandists on liability. Ukraine Media Center is coming back in operation tomorrow. We're putting together the schedule for tomorrow. Thank you for staying tuned.